Hogwarts. What's the news?
Presenting to you from the Daily Prophet Smuggle affiliate.
Live from NPR News in Washington, I'm Nora Rahm.
Before I get started, this tutorial, like previous ones, assumes a basic understanding of the Rhasspy and conductor frameworks. Also, unlike previous tutorials where I would do a voiceover of the recording, I'm going to take a stab at doing this as a one take with minimal edits. So let's get started. So before we start messing with Rhasspy or the conductor, we need to figure out where we're getting our news from. So in this case, we're going to be fetching our news from the hourly NPR News podcast, and a simple internet search for NPR News podcast uh, gets us this, and we can see that NPR News Now has a RSS link, and this XML document will give us everything that we need to programmatically parse out what the hourly news stream is from NPR. So we're going to keep this in mind, we're going to save this, and we'll be referencing back to this later once we actually start developing our news service within the conductor. So now that we know where we're going to get our news from, we can jump back over to Rhasspy and define our intent for triggering the news. So we'll go over to sentences, and we'll call this new intent news latest, but not caps. And the triggering sentence will be, what's the news? So we'll save, which will retrain the profile. And we can jump back over to the home screen to ensure that our new sentence is detected. And sure enough, it is. So now we can jump over to the conductor and define a handler for this new intent. We don't have a news handler yet, so we'll create a new file, call it news.py, and start defining our news handler. All handlers are derived from the base handler, so we'll do that. We'll call it news handler and extend from our base handler, which we need to import. So now we can define our constructor. And we'll give a base path for this handler as news in case we want to interact with the handler directly through HTTP calls. But we won't be going over that in this tutorial. That's documented in the conductor's documentation. So now we need to make this handler aware of what intents it's able to accept. So we'll just create a constant here and we'll call it news latest, and we'll give it a string, which is the name of the intent that we just defined in Rhasspy. And then we'll reference that here. So this is basically telling the news handler that it is aware, it is able to accept and process the news latest intent. Now we need to actually add the handling for that intent. So we will override the handle intent method and say if the intent that was received, and we'll access it by name, we'll check its name, is the news latest intent, do something with it. So what do we want to do with it? We want to define a new method, and we'll just call this latest for the latest news. And what do we want to do with this? We'll just invoke the latest, the latest news method on our news service, which we haven't defined yet, but we will in a moment. So we'll return self-conductor news, and we'll invoke the latest method. So now here we can just call the latest method. So just sort of recapping what we did here is we defined a new handler that's derived from the base handler. It is able to process the news latest intent, and the only thing that it's doing here when it's handling that intent is invoking the latest method, which in turn calls the latest method on the news service, which we will define here in a moment. So let's jump over and define a service for our news. So similar to the handler, we don't have a news service yet, so let's create a new Python file, call it news.py. And like all of our conductor services, this is going to be derived from the base service. So let's get started. We'll call it news service, base service. And just like the handler, we need to import our base. And define our constructor. And we'll give our news service the alias name of just news. So that way we can just access it by the reference of news whenever we're calling it on the conductor. All right. So some other things that I know that we're going to want some configuration. For instance, the URL of where the NPR feed is coming from, that XML document, for instance, that RSS feed, and maybe some timeouts and where we want to cache any of the feed information for reuse, because we know that NPR news feeds, they rotate on an hourly basis. So if we already have, for instance, the news for the current hour, there's no reason for us to refetch it. We should be able to just pull from our cache. So let's start defining some properties for our news service here, and our feed. We're gonna have that in our configuration, our YAML config. So I guess I need to import the config module. And let's call this is going to be an application, part of our application config. It's not protected. There's no secrets that are contained within here, so we'll use the application config for it. We'll store everything under an NPR space, and we'll call this first one podcast, and then specifically the URL for the podcast feed. And I said we also wanted some timeout settings. That would be like request timeout, because we don't want to sit here and churn for forever whenever we're requesting the feed. So let's define a timeout and copy and paste for speed. And we'll just call this timeout, the setting timeout, that is. Okay. And we'll jump over into our YAML file and define these in a moment. But let's add some additional settings. So we know that we're gonna want to cache the results, like I said a moment ago. So let's define our cache path, and that's going to be in resources cache, and we'll just call it news cache and be done with it. But we need to actually like populate that path if it doesn't exist. So we'll use the Python pathlib library for that. It'll do the heavy lifting for us. And we'll import path. So from that, we can now call path and reference the cache path that we just defined, and we'll invoke make directory. It'll create parents. We'll set that to true, and we don't want to error out if it already exists. So we'll set exist OK equals to true as well. Okay. think that's all the settings that we're gonna need. So let's go ahead and actually populate our settings in the application YAML. Okay, so we can see we've got some settings from some previous tutorials. So what did I say? We were going to set this in the NPR path, and then under that, we're going to define podcast. And then under podcast, we've got URL. Oops, I think I had it as lowercase. Let's double check. Yep, lowercase. URL, which is going to be some string, some path to that podcast XML document, and then a timeout, which let's just say for 3 seconds. Okay, so let's get our path, which is going to be this URL because we're going to want to process this XML document. So we'll set that as our path. Okay, so application NPR podcast URL and timeout. Application NPR podcast URL and then timeout. Okay, that looks fine to me. So we should be able to start adding our service code. And if we recall in the handler, the method on our service is going to be called latest. So let's go ahead and create a stub for that. And we're not going to do anything with it just yet. So what we're going to want to do is now start to process that XML document from NPR. So let's jump back over and take a closer look at this and see what elements really matter to us here. We can see that the audio is down within this content element, which is contained, so that's within, more specifically, that's within enclosure, which is within content, which is within item, which is within channel. Okay, so we should be able to parse that out pretty easily. And not only that, we've got, because we're going to want to save this information off, so we're probably going to give a file name to the downloaded MP3 file. So we could use the name, I suppose, that is within the file itself, but let's give it, let's create our own name, and we'll parse that information out of some of the content that is contained within. Looks like there's a title. Yeah, this, let's do that. We'll parse the title elements, format it a little bit, and use that as the basis for the file name. Okay, let's give that a shot. So instead of doing all of that work within our latest method, let's create just a standalone method for it, something private. We'll call it, I don't know, fetch latest. And that in turn will be called from our latest method. But this will allow a little bit of segmentation in the sense that the latest method will be responsible for the exception handling, things of that nature, whereas our fetch latest will do the actual processing of the XML documents, determining whether or not we already have the current news feed in our cache, and then returning whatever the latest is to our latest method to ultimately play it as an audio feed. Okay, so let's get our feed going here. Let's create a variable called feed. Oh, we need something to parse the XML document. So let's use Python's element tree for that. So let's import it. It's etree element tree. But instead of having that, let's just alias it as et, which is, I think, a common pattern that you'll see online. Excuse me. So, okay, so let's begin processing our feed. So we'll use et, and we'll call from string, but we need to actually get the document. So we need to import the requests library as well because we're going to send a HTTP request to actually get that XML document from the internet. So let's import the requests library and start to use it. So this is just going to be a get request. So we'll use requests, get, uh, but what's our path? Well, we have that already as our underscore feed property. So we can say we want to get the feed, and we did want a timeout. So let's set our timeouts to the property as well. And we want to fetch the content from that request, and we'll decode it, if I could spell, there we go. And we'll decode it as UTF-8. Okay, so let's take a look at this. So element tree from string, what that string is going to be fetched using the request library from this feed, but we're going to time out if we can't access it in 3 seconds. And then we will fetch the content and decode it as using UTF-8. Okay, so now we can actually start processing that element tree object. So, which is feed. So what do we want to get from that? So let's take a look at what this looks like. So I think, so our parent is going to be channel. So we can look for channel. Then our content, I think the only content that we care about here, there's obviously a bunch more content that you could experiment with, but so there's a JPEG, for instance, if you wanted to get fancy and display it somewhere. This is a voice interface, so that's not really applicable. Uh, but okay, so we've got channel, and then within channel, there's item. Let's start there. So let's get our channel item, and then dig a little bit deeper. And then we can process that channel item a bit more to build out, to get out like the title and the audio path, and then we can actually download it. So let's jump back over and let's get the channel item. Let's just call a variable channel item. And from our feed, which is our element, right, that we just built, we can find another element called channel, and then within channel, we'll do a find for an element called item. So there's really no point in saving off channel because we only care about item. So there's probably a different search mechanism that you could use with element tree to just get the item, but we're going to do sort of a two-step approach. We're going to find the channel, and then we'll find the item, and we'll call that channel item. So now that we've got our channel item, which is really just this here, we've got a reference to this structure. We really care about the title because we said that we were going to use the title for our file name in the cache, and the remote audio path, which is going to be this URL. So let's go ahead and define 2 variables for both of those, and we should be able to interact with our channel item to extract both of those pieces of information. So let's start with the audio first. So we'll just call this remote audio, and within our channel item, we're going to find, I think it was called enclosure. Yes, we're going to look for enclosure, and then we're going to get the URL attribute. So let's find enclosure, and let's get the URL attribute. Okay, so this should be whatever the value is for the URL attribute within the enclosure element, which is the HTTP path to the whatever the current hourly news is. Excellent. Okay, so now let's get our title. We'll just call this variable title. Again, we can interact with channel item to find, what was it called? I think it was just title. Yep, the element is title. And within the title, we want to actually get the text content of that element. Uh, but we're going to want to format it because that doesn't, in its current form, if we look, doesn't really make for a good file name. So I think let's get rid of the colon, and maybe let's replace all spaces with underscores, so that way we're not dealing with spaces. Yeah, so let's start there. So let's just get rid of the colon altogether and replace the spaces with underscores and see how that goes. Okie dokie. So now we've got the text content, but we want to replace, if I replace, what did we say? We want to replace the colon with nothing. And we also wanted to replace all spaces with, what did I say, an underscore. So let's look at that. Yep, so we're going to replace both of those. So I think we're good with our title now. Okay, so next, let's go ahead and download the file. So we're gonna, I don't know, let's call this like the fetched audio, which is the actual audio file. So we're going to use the request library for that to get the remote audio. So let's call this fetched audio, and we'll use the request library again. Oops, requests library. And we'll use a get request. And we know the path is our remote audio path. And we're going to use the same 3 seconds timeout for this request. Timeout equals self underscore timeout. Okay, but now we want to save this audio in our cache. So how do we want to go about doing that? We'll do with open, what are we calling our file? Oh, something I didn't do. We need to actually define the path to our file in the cache. So let's call this latest, and I guess we'll use the OS library to define this full path. So let's see, OS path join, because we want our cache path to be joined with uh, the title, and we're gonna put a prefix, a file extension of MP3 on it as well. So we'll say cache, and then the actual name of the file, which is going to be the title, not MPS, MP3. Okay, so let's take a look at this. So our path to the latest audio file is going to be in our cache. Yeah, it's going to be the title.mp3 in our cache path. Great. So now we can save that. We can get back to where we were. We have our fetched audio. We're going to write that to a local file called latest, which is going to be in our cache. So with open latest, and we'll write it in binary. We'll say F. We'll alias it as F, so that way we can just do write. And our fetched audio, we just want to write the entire content of the of what we fetched from the remote audio file. So we've got our remote audio file. We've aliased that as a variable here for fetched audio, but we need to actually get the content from it, which is what this is going to do, and write that content to our local cache file, which is called latest. Okay, so then from that we can return latest, which is going to be the path to the file in the cache. So let's take a quick look at this and recap. So we're getting our elements, our parent element, and then parsing out the item from it. We're going to get the remote audio path. We're going to build a title file name. We're going to actually populate the full path to that file and fetch the audio from that remote audio path and save that MP3 content into our local file, and then return the path to that file in our cache. So we're basically going to download it, save it in the cache, and then return the path to where that file exists in the cache. Great. But we're not done yet. So what good is a cache if we're always overwriting the file? So now we need to actually add a check to see if this file exists already in the cache, and only fetch it if it does not yet exist. So let's do a little conditional block here. So if the to basically just check and see if the file exists already in the cache. So we'll use exists in the OS path library. Uh, latest. So if it does not exist, then we will download it. And let's add a little logging message just for the heck of it. So that way it'll be helpful in debugging. And we'll say that if it does exist, that we're just going to be playing audio from cache. And we'll give the file name, the path to the file name in the cache. But we need to import our logger, so let's do that. We'll import logging first, and then actually set up the logger. Great. All right, so let's take another quick look at this. Looks okay. Yeah, so if it's not in our cache path, if it doesn't exist already, then go ahead and download it and save it to the cache. But we're always going to be returning the path from the cache. We just don't want to, greedily refetch unnecessarily. So now we can add our latest, the content for our latest method. So what we're going to want to do is let's just set a variable for the file. We'll call it the news file. And again, we're going to get that from our fetch latest method, which is really just going to be a path to that audio file in our cache. And from that, well, we want to actually hear it. So we can use the audio service within the conductor to play that audio file. So we can just say self conductor audio play, but we need to send a play request to that method call. And I guess I need to import that as well, which that's going to be in service audio play request. But the play request needs path to the file, which is again just going to be news file. Okay, so what we've got going on here is our latest method is going to get a path to the file from the cache, and then it's going to create a play request and send that over to our play service to actually play the audio. Okay, so what about adding a little bit of Harry Potter inspiration to this? So because Harry Potter, the news outlet is the Daily Prophet. There's no, knowledge of NPR. So I think let's add our funny phrase, our funny intro, I should say, to the playing of the NPR hourly news, and we'll say that it's being played from the Daily Prophet's Muggle affiliate, which is NPR in our case. So before actually playing the audio, we want to perform that action, and we're going to use the TTS service on the conductor to facilitate that behavior. So let's call the TTS service, and we want to speak a response. And in this case, so I think I'm going to need to import response as well. I think that's actually in the base service. So I should be able to just do this. Yeah, and that was a bad auto import, which I'll delete. All right, so now I should be able to create our response and give it the text presenting to you from the Daily Prophet. Muggle affiliate. Okay, so before hearing our audio file, we'll now hear the TTS engine saying, presenting to you from the Daily Prophet's Muggle affiliate. But we also want a fun background track to play at the same time in which we're hearing this TTS audio. Like in a previous video where I described that you can specify a background play track for all of these response objects, we're going to do the same thing here. And in this case, we're going to be using an audio track that I've pre-downloaded, which is the sounds of newspaper shuffling and typewriters going. So that way it sounds like the uh, audio is being heard from a news reporting office. And I'll include a link in the video description, which will show you where I obtained those sound effects from. I didn't create them myself. I just downloaded them from a sound effects mixer website that has some fun Harry Potter related sound effects. So again, check the description below for those details. But I already have that pre-downloaded. That's in my effects folder under news and then Daily Prophet. So now I should be able to just define that path for my background audio track in the response object. And I know that the volume is exactly where I want it, so I don't need to do any background volume shift for this track, so I'll just set that to 0. The default in the conductor is to make the background audio a little quieter by a setting of 20, but in this case I already have the audio where I want it, so I'm going to leave it as is. Okay, so I think that's looking pretty good. But what about exceptions? Because failures will always happen. So like other services, we're going to want to wrap this method call, or the behavior, I should say, within a try catch block, and then we'll report some sort of exception. We'll raise we'll call it a news failure, so that way the framework knows that it's coming from the news service. So let's do our block here, and we're going to be real greedy here. We're just going to catch anything. And we'll raise, well, we don't have that exception defined yet, so we'll just do pass for now. And like all service calls, we want to return a response, but in this case, our response is just going to be an empty response because the actual behavior is occurring within this block. There is no response object that the conductor framework needs to speak because we're handling that explicitly within our method. So let's go ahead and define the news failure exception. So if we go into our errors and just define, similar to what we did with weather, if you watched that previous video, we'll just define a news failure, and we'll say that this is a speakable exception. Again, check the conductor documentation for what it means to be a speakable exception. So now we can jump back over and we can raise a news failure, but we want to, well, import it, which is in exceptions, news failure. So the other thing that we'll want is some sort of speakable exception, speakable error, I should say, that we would hear in the event of any sort of a failure here. Other things that you could also do is add some logging. We're going to keep it pretty simple here. This has already gone on for quite a while. So if you wanted to get information about the underlying exception, you could log it here or elsewhere, however you want to do it. But we do want to have some sort of audible error indicator to anyone using the conductor in Rhasspy, so that way they know that there was a failure processing the request, but essentially processing the news latest intent. So what we'll do is we'll just do a general failure, similar to what we've done with other intents. So we'll just import the get general failure function from our reasons module. And we'll just call that here to populate it with some sort of a general failure. Okay, so I think this is looking pretty good. Well, we'll know in a moment. So let's fire up. Oh, you know what? We still need to do. We actually need to wire in the handler and service into the conductor itself. I do plan a future version of the conductor in which this will not need to be an explicit step, but haven't gotten there yet. So, okay, so let's actually import our service and handler. And then wire them into the conductor. Okay, so now I think we are good to go. So let's fire this up and run a quick test. Okay, this is a good first step. We can see that the conductor is listening. So now let's go back over to Rhasspy, and we actually want it to handle the intents this time, so that way we can see if the conductor is able to successfully process the request.
Presenting to you from the Daily Profits Muggle affiliate.
Looking good so far.
Live from NPR News
There we
in
are.
Washington, I'm Nora Rahm.
Okay, so there we have it. We've got our new intents defined in Rhasspy and the handler and service code defined within the conductor. So I guess let's make sure our cache is working. So if we fire this up again real quick, we want to make sure that we're not re-downloading the same file. So we should see our logging message that we're playing audio from the cache, assuming that we have this check set up correctly. So let's do this one last test, and then we'll call it.
Presenting to you from the
There
Daily
we go.
Profits Muggle affiliate.
And I'll just kill it, and we can see here now it's playing audio from cache instead of re-downloading it. So there we have it. We've got our Daily Profit news being supplied by the Muggle affiliate NPR, and it will rotate because again the rotation is automatic. NPR will publish a new hourly news. They'll update the XML document every hour to point to a new file. So I unless they change their XML document and their RSS feed that we were pointing to actually fetch the content. If they ever change the structure of this, of course you would have to change your conductor code, but this should give you a good starting point at least. You could of course add logic to consume other news sources if you didn't want to hear NPR. You could use a similar technique for other news outlets. There we go. Hope this was enjoyable and fun, and I hope that you learned something. So until next time, peace.